The night Ruth Vaughn was lost in a card game. The saloon smelled of coal oil and cheap whiskey, and she stood in the corner with her hands folded in front of her like a woman who had already made peace with every terrible thing the world could do. She was 22 years old, 5 feet and 4 inches of quiet dignity, wrapped in a calico dress that had been washed so many times the blue had faded nearly to gray. Her dark hair was pinned up at the back of her neck, and her eyes, deep brown, steady as river stone, had long ago learned the particular art of looking at nothing while seeing everything. She had been standing in that corner of the Dusty Rose Saloon in Caldwell, Kansas, for the better part of an hour, since the moment Harlan Voss had brought her inside and told her to stay put and look presentable, as though she were a horse he intended to sell. It was the spring of 1878, and Caldwell sat right on the edge of the Indian Territory border, a cattle town that swallowed drovers and spat out their bones, where the wind off the southern plains smelled of dust and freedom, and something faintly dangerous that a person could never quite name. The cattle trails brought money and men in equal measure, and the saloons stayed open until the money ran out. On any given night, a man with good cards and bad judgment could win or lose a horse, a plot of land, a saddle worth more than most men's monthly wages. Ruth Vaughn already knew, from the way Harlan's hands had been shaking since they'd ridden into town that afternoon, that tonight was going to cost somebody something significant. She just had not expected it to cost her. Harlan Voss was her stepfather in the loosest, most transactional sense of the word. He had married her mother, Clara, 4 years prior, when Ruth was 18 and Clara was desperate enough to say yes to a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes. Clara had died of fever the previous winter, and whatever legal or moral obligation Harlan might have pretended to feel toward Ruth had dissolved along with his grief, which had itself dissolved with admirable speed. He was a gambling man. He was always a gambling man. Ruth had known that the moment she'd looked into his eyes at her mother's wedding and understood, with the particular clarity that comes to young women who have learned to read danger in small signals, that this man would eventually reduce everything in his life to a wager. She had not known she would be the final chip. The poker table was set up in the back of the saloon, near the piano that a tired-looking man played with 2 fingers on one hand and 3 on the other. A slow, melancholy tune that seemed entirely appropriate to Ruth's situation. 4 men sat around the table: Harlan, red-faced and already losing, a cattle merchant from Wichita who smelled of bay rum and arrogance, a quiet Mexican vaquero named Delgado who had barely spoken a word all evening, and the man Ruth had noticed the moment she'd walked in, though she had not allowed herself to look at him directly since. He was tall even sitting down, which was the kind of detail that told a person something. Lean but built solid through the shoulders in the way that came from actual work rather than vanity. His hat was pushed back on his head, dark brown, battered at the brim, and his hair beneath it was the color of black coffee, curling slightly at the temples where the sweat of a long day's ride had dampened it. His jaw was strong and unshaved by 2 days at least, and his hands, when he reached for his cards, were the hands of a man who had mended fences and branded cattle and done every honest labor that the frontier demanded. He had hazel eyes that caught the lamplight in a way that was almost unsettling, because they looked amused and careful at the same time, like a man who found the world funny without being careless about it. His name, Ruth would learn, was Elijah McCrae. He was 26 years old, and he had ridden down from his family's ranch outside of Abilene on a cattle business errand that had already taken longer than he'd intended. He had stopped at the Dusty Rose because his horse needed a night in a real stable, and because he was tired, and because sometimes a man sat down at a card table not because he meant to win anything in particular, but because the lamplight was warm and the alternative was lying in a hotel room listening to Caldwell make its nightly noise. He had not intended to win a woman. Ruth heard the critical hand play out from her corner. She did not move. She had learned, living with Harlan these 4 years, that the best thing a person with no power in a situation could do was be completely still and completely silent and watch everything that was happening with absolute attention, because information was the only currency available to the powerless. She heard Harlan's voice go high, and desperate the way it always did when he was losing badly. She heard him push something across the table with a sound of scraping wood on wood. She heard the cattle merchant laugh and the vaquero make a soft, disapproving noise under his breath. She heard Elijah McCrae say nothing at all. The hand was laid down. There was a pause that stretched long enough for the piano player's melody to cycle through an entire verse. Then she heard Harlan's chair scrape back, and she knew from the particular violence of the sound that he had lost everything. And she heard him say, in a voice that had the horrible brightness of a man trying to appear unconcerned with his own catastrophe, "The girl over there, that's my stepdaughter. I'm putting her in. She's a hard worker, good with a household. I've got papers on her, legal and signed." Ruth did not move. She did not make a sound. Her hands stayed folded. Her eyes stayed fixed on the middle distance. Because making a scene would accomplish nothing, and crying would accomplish nothing, and begging would accomplish nothing, and she had run out of illusions about what sentiment could achieve in a world run by men like Harlan Voss. She simply stood and breathed and waited to see what would happen next. There was a long silence from the table. The cattle merchant said, with the jovial cruelty of a man who found other people's desperation entertaining, "Well now, that's a new kind of ante." Delgado the vaquero said quietly and firmly, "I fold." Ruth heard the shift of attention at the table, that specific charging of the air that told her every eye in that corner of the saloon had moved to Elijah McCrae. She still did not look directly at him. She was aware of his hazel eyes on her. She could feel it the way you feel weather changing. But she held herself still and gave him nothing to see but composure, because composure was the last thing she owned outright. Elijah McCrae looked at the woman in the faded blue dress standing in the corner with her hands folded and her eyes steady, and something shifted behind his chest that he would not have known how to name if someone had asked him to. He had been on the frontier long enough to understand that bad things happen to people without power, and long enough to know that standing at the edge of a bad situation and deciding not to act was its own kind of action. He looked at Harlan Voss, who had the sweating, shifty look of a man who had descended below his own low standard, and he looked at the papers Harlan had slapped onto the table, some kind of guardianship document, yellowed at the edges, and he made a decision in the space of 4 seconds that he would spend the next several months understanding. "I'll see your last hand," he said, and he played it and he won. The saloon did its brief flare of noise, boots scraping, glasses raised, the particular appreciative murmur that accompanied any significant win. And then Harlan Voss stood up and crossed the room to Ruth without looking her in the eye, which was the only honest thing he'd done all evening, and he said, "That's McCrae's now," as though he were pointing out a saddle hanging on a wall, and then he walked out of the saloon and out of Ruth Vaughn's life without a backward glance. Ruth stood where she was. After a moment she heard boots on the wooden floor, unhurried, heading toward her corner. She lifted her eyes then, because not meeting his gaze would have been a kind of collapse, and she found those hazel eyes already on her, closer than she'd expected, and warmer, and not at all what she'd been bracing for. He was even taller standing than he'd seemed at the table. He stopped a respectful distance away, the distance a person keeps when they are conscious of not wanting to frighten someone, and he had the papers in his hand, Harlan's yellow, creased documents, and he looked at them once without expression. Then he tore them in half. Then he tore those halves in half again, and he set the pieces on the windowsill as though they were nothing more consequential than the remains of a meal, and he looked at her and he said, "I don't own anyone, and I didn't sit in this game to collect a person." His voice was low and direct, without performance. "My name is Elijah McCrae. What's yours?" And Ruth Vaughn, who had not spoken a single word since she'd entered that saloon and been turned into a wager, who had stood through the whole terrible hour with her hands folded and her silence wrapped around her like armor, looked at the torn pieces of paper on the windowsill and felt something unlock in her chest that she could not immediately identify. She said, "Ruth Vaughn." She said it clearly, with all her name in it, the way a person says a thing they have been waiting to be permitted to say. He nodded, as though that was exactly the right answer to have given. "Well, Miss Vaughn," he said, "the night's not particularly safe for a woman alone in Caldwell, and I expect you've got nowhere particular to go right now, which is Harlan Voss's fault and nobody else's. There's a respectable boarding house 2 streets over run by a woman named Ida Perkins. I can walk you there and pay for your room tonight, and tomorrow we can figure out what you'd like to do." He paused. "That's all I'm offering. No strings on it." Ruth looked at him for a long moment. She was a careful woman, made careful by necessity, and she had learned not to trust ease when it appeared suddenly in the middle of difficulty. But there was something in the straightforward plainness of what he'd said, the absence of maneuvering in it, the way he'd framed it around what she'd like to do, that she found, cautiously, credible. "All right," she said. "Thank you." They walked out of the dusty Rose Saloon side by side into the Caldwell night, the piano music trailing after them until the door swung shut. And above the town the Kansas sky was enormous and black and strewn with more stars than a person could ever count. And the warm spring wind moved through the street with the smell of the grasslands on it. And Ruth breathed it in deeply, because outside smelled like the possibility of being unowned, and that was the finest smell she could currently imagine. Ida Perkins was a short, solid woman of about 50 who answered her door with a lamp in her hand, and the expression of someone who had seen everything Caldwell had to offer and been impressed by none of it. She looked at Elijah, then at Ruth, then at Elijah again, with the particular measuring gaze of a woman who ran a respectable establishment. "She's had a difficult evening," Elijah said simply. "She needs a room for tonight and whatever she needs to get settled." Ida studied Ruth's face for a moment, and whatever she saw there satisfied her because she opened the door wider and said, "Come in then. I've got a room on the 2nd floor. It's small but clean." She looked at Elijah again. "You'll be at the Caldwell Hotel?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good." She handed Ruth the lamp. "You look like you could use some hot water and something to eat." Ruth said that would be very kind and followed Ida inside, and at the door she stopped and turned and looked back at Elijah McCrae standing in the street with the star-thick sky behind him, and she said, "I don't have a way to repay you right now." He shook his head, a small, dismissive motion. "I don't need repaying. Sleep well, Miss Vaughn." She went inside. The door closed. Elijah stood in the street for another few seconds, the night air around him, thinking about hazel eyes and folded hands and the specific dignity of a woman who refuses to break even when everything around her is trying to accomplish exactly that. Then he walked back toward the hotel, and the spring stars tracked him all the way. She did not expect to see him again. She was wrong. In the morning, she came downstairs to find that Ida Perkins had already been in communication with half of Caldwell, in the way that small-town women are able to communicate before the rest of the world has finished its coffee. And Ruth learned over a breakfast of salt pork and biscuits that Harlan Voss had in fact left town sometime in the small hours, which resolved one question definitively. She also learned that she had to her name exactly the contents of the small cloth bag she had been permitted to carry when Harlan had brought her to Caldwell, which amounted to 1 change of clothes, a bone comb, her mother's silver brooch, and 37 cents. She was sitting in Ida's small parlor working through the problem of what to do next with the methodical calm that she brought to all problems, when there was a knock at the door. Elijah McCrae stood on the step in the morning light with his hat in his hands, which she noted immediately as a gesture of courtesy that most men in her experience didn't think to make. He looked rested and clean-shaved now, and the morning light showed that there was a small scar at the corner of his jaw, probably from something involving either wire or a horse's hoof, and his hazel eyes were clear and direct. "I wanted to check on you," he said, "and I wanted to ask something if you're willing to hear it." She stepped back from the door. Come in. Ida won't mind. He came into the parlor and held his hat and said, looking at her carefully, I'm heading back to my family's ranch outside Abilene today. It's a 2-day ride. My mother runs the household and we have 3 ranch hands. I've got a good-sized working operation. He paused. We could use someone who's good with the household management, the cooking, the accounting of supplies. I heard Voss say you were capable, and I tend to believe capable people who have been through what you've been through usually are. Ruth studied him. You're offering me work. Yes. Honest pay, your own room, no obligations beyond the work. You can leave whenever you want. I'll give you that in writing if it helps. She considered this for a long moment. The alternative was Caldwell with 37 cents, which was not truly an alternative at all. But it was not the arithmetic that made up her mind so much as the memory of him tearing those papers without hesitation, without drama, without making it about himself. That had been a telling thing. People told you who they were in small, unrehearsed moments, if you knew how to look. All right, she said. I'd like that in writing. Something moved in his eyes that might have been the beginning of a smile. He wrote it out on a page from his small notebook, in a hand that was clear and deliberate, and handed it to her. She read it through completely before she folded it and put it in her dress pocket. I'll be ready in an hour, she said. The ride north to Abilene took 2.5 days, because the rains that had blessed the southern Kansas plains that spring had turned certain stretches of the trail into a sucking mud that slowed them considerably. They camped one night on the open prairie under a sky that Ruth found she had been missing without knowing it, because she had spent the past year in the cramped interior of Harlan's cabin and had forgotten how large the world became when there was nothing between you and the horizon. Elijah built the fire with the efficiency of long practice, and he made coffee that was strong and honest, and they ate salt beef and hard bread, and for a long while neither of them said anything, which Ruth found, to her surprise, entirely comfortable. He was not a man who filled silence with noise for the sake of it. He seemed content to let the prairie speak, the wind in the grass and the faraway sound of something moving in the dark, and she respected that quality of stillness in him. Eventually she said, How long have you been running the ranch? Since my father died, 4 years ago. He was thrown from a horse. He fed a stick into the fire. My mother stayed on. She's a practical woman, my mother. She decided grief was something you did and then put away, and she's been managing the kitchen and the books and my younger brother's education with about equal efficiency ever since. How old is your brother? Thomas. He's 19 now, heading to Kansas City in the fall to study law if the plan holds. He looked at her across the fire. You have family anywhere. My mother died last winter. She said it plainly, the way you said things that hurt when you had already held the hurt for a long time. No one else. He nodded, and he did not offer condolences in the careless way people sometimes did, as though the words were an obligation to discharge. He simply acknowledged the fact of it with a nod, and that felt more respectful to her than most of what people said. I'm sorry about what happened to you, he said then quietly. At the saloon. She looked at the fire. It was not the worst thing Harlan Voss did to me, she said. It was only the most public. Silence. Then are you all right? Not the polite answer, the true one. She looked at him across the fire, surprised by the directness of it. She thought about it genuinely as he'd asked. I am angry, she said at last. Not right now in this moment, but underneath I'm very angry. At him, at the circumstances that made it possible, at the fact that it can be done at all. A woman can be put in a card game like a saddle or a horse, and the law mostly doesn't have anything to say about it. She paused. But I'm not broken. I want to be clear about that. I'm not something that needs fixing. I didn't think you were, he said, and his voice was so simply certain of it that she believed him. She slept that night wrapped in the spare blanket from his saddlebag, near enough to the fire's warmth, and above her the Milky Way stretched clear across the darkness like a road made of light, and she thought, I'm still here. I'm still whole. And whatever comes next, I am the one who will decide it. The McCrae Ranch sat in a broad green valley north of Abilene, in the rolling limestone country where the prairie grass grew thick, and the creek that ran through the property never quite dried up even in a drought year. It was a working cattle ranch of real substance, a proper frame house painted white, with a porch across the front and a kitchen garden along the east side, a barn big enough for 12 horses, a bunkhouse for the hands, and beyond all of it, pasture rolling out in every direction to meet the tree-lined creek. Ruth saw it first on the morning of the third day as they came over a low rise, and the sight of it settled, purposeful, rooted in the land struck something in her that she had not expected. Margaret McCrae was waiting on the porch. She was a woman of 51 who had the same strong build as her son and eyes that were lighter, gray-green, and just as direct. She watched them ride up without expression, and Ruth met her gaze from the saddle and held it, because flinching first was not something Ruth Vaughn did. "Mother," Elijah said, dismounting, "this is Ruth Vaughn. I've hired her to help with the household. I'll explain everything. She's had a difficult time and she's competent and she's going to be good here." Margaret descended the porch steps and stood in front of Ruth, who had dismounted herself and now stood holding her small cloth bag with both hands. Margaret looked at her for a long, measuring moment, and then she said, "Can you cook?" "Yes." "Can you keep accounts?" "Yes." "Are you afraid of hard work?" "No." Margaret nodded once, with the satisfaction of a woman who had asked exactly the questions she needed to ask and gotten exactly the answers she'd been hoping for. "Come inside," she said. "I'll show you your room and then we'll find you something to eat." She turned toward the house and then paused and looked back. "And whatever happened in Caldwell," she said, with the brisk directness of someone who did not traffic in unnecessary drama, "you are here now, and this is a decent household, and you'll be treated accordingly." Ruth swallowed something that felt alarmingly close to tears, which she absolutely did not cry. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Margaret said. "Work well." "That's all the thanks I need." The first weeks at the McCrae Ranch passed with the particular beauty of honest labor in a good place. Ruth found her footing with the kind of careful, methodical energy she brought to everything. She learned the kitchen's rhythms, Margaret's sourdough starter that lived in a crock on the top shelf and had to be fed every 3 days, the root cellar's organization, which was sensible but could be improved, the fact that Thomas McCrae, Elijah's younger brother, could eat a truly alarming volume of food for a young man who was otherwise perfectly pleasant and apparently serious about his law books. Thomas was 19, light-hearted where his brother was steady, with a quick smile and no evident interest in anything more dramatic than getting to Kansas City and beginning his education. Ruth took over the household accounts inside a week and found 3 years of modest but consistent disorganization that she quietly remedied. She reorganized the root cellar according to a system that made seasonal sense. She planted more of the kitchen garden, which had been somewhat neglected, and she started a correspondence with a seed merchant in Abilene about drought-resistant varieties that might do better in a dry year. Margaret noticed all of this. Margaret noticed everything. But she did not comment on it, which Ruth found she preferred to excessive praise. She simply adjusted her own expectations to account for the new standard, which was the highest form of acknowledgement a practical woman could offer. Elijah she saw every day, in the way that people who share a property necessarily see each other. At meals, in passing between the house and the barn, occasionally in the evenings when he came to the porch after supper with a cup of coffee and sat in the chair near the end while the sun went down over the pasture. These were not conversations exactly, not at first. They were shared presences. Two people in the same space, comfortable with the silence between them, which is a thing that takes most people years to achieve, and which Ruth and Elijah seemed to arrive at with a naturalness that should have told them both something. She noticed him. She noticed the particular quality of his attention to things, to the cattle, to the hands, to his mother, to small problems on the ranch that he addressed without drama and without delegation. She noticed that he was the kind of man who did not claim credit for things and did not seek to be observed doing them, and she had grown up with enough of the opposite sort to understand exactly how rare that was. He noticed her. He noticed the way she went still when she was thinking hard about something, her hands quiet and her eyes focused on a point in the middle distance. He noticed that she'd found his father's small collection of books in the parlor, and was working through them with the systematic pleasure of someone who had always been hungry for what books offered. He noticed the way she stood at the edge of the porch in the evenings and looked out at the grassland with an expression he could only describe as relief, as though open space was something she had been denied and was now quietly consuming in daily doses. He had learned the broad facts of what Harlan Voss had been, from what she'd said at the campfire and from what she hadn't said, and the anger he felt about it was the clean, cold kind that did not look for drama, but simply settled into a man and made him certain about things. He was certain that no one was ever going to treat Ruth Vaughn as a commodity again, not in his presence. He was certain that she deserved every decent thing and had been given precious little of it. And he was beginning to be certain, less comfortably, because it complicated everything, that he was developing feelings for her that were far warmer than an employer's regard for a capable employee. The moment that shifted things from proximity into something unmistakably different came about 6 weeks after Ruth's arrival, on an evening in late May that was warm enough to sit outside but cool enough to be comfortable. Ruth had come to the porch with a book she'd been meaning to finish, and Elijah had already been there with his coffee, and they'd sat in their respective chairs as they sometimes did, and the silence had been pleasant, and then she'd said, without looking up from her book, "Do you actually like ranching, or is it just what there was to do when your father died?" He looked at her, surprised by the directness of it. Then he thought about it honestly. "Both, I think. It was what there was, but I've come to love it." He paused. "There's something about working with land that's honest. It tells you the truth. Bad soil, drought, poor decisions, the land shows it all plainly. Good work shows too. It doesn't flatter you and it doesn't lie to you." She looked up from her book then. "I understand that," she said. "I've been thinking about that, about honest things." "What do you mean?" She set the book down on her knee and looked at the pasture, where the evening light was turning the grass a color between gold and green that didn't have a proper name. "I spent 4 years living inside Harlan's dishonesty," she said. "Everything was managed, everything was a transaction, everything meant something other than what it looked like. I got very good at seeing through things." She glanced at him. "And then you sat down in that saloon and didn't manage anything. You just did a plain, honest thing and said plain, honest words, and I didn't quite know what to do with it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Does it feel safer now, being here?" "Yes," she said. "It does." And then, because she was Ruth Vaughn and she was honest even about the complicated things, she added, "Which is a new feeling. I'm not entirely used to it yet." "Take your time," he said simply, and he meant it, and she could hear that he meant it, and that was the moment, not dramatic, not thunderous, not signaled by anything more than the honesty of his voice in the evening air, that Ruth Vaughn began, carefully and against her own best intentions, to fall in love with Elijah McCrae. The summer came in hot and bright, the way Kansas summers do, without apology. The cattle business kept Elijah busy and away from the ranch house frequently. He rode into Abilene for business, went out to the south pasture for days at a time with the hands, managed the ongoing business of a working cattle operation with the focused competence that characterized everything he did. Ruth managed the house and the garden and the accounts and felt, for the first time in years, like a person whose work had value and whose opinion on things was considered worth hearing. Margaret McCrae asked her opinion regularly. This was perhaps the most unexpected thing about Margaret. She was not a woman who shared authority easily, but she seemed to have looked at Ruth and understood something, and from the second week onward she had begun saying things like, "What do you think about putting the canning up early this year, given how the garden's going?" Or, "Look at these supply figures and tell me if you see what I see." And Ruth's answers were apparently satisfactory because the questions kept coming. One afternoon in July, Margaret and Ruth were working together in the kitchen, putting up tomatoes from the garden, the room hot and smelling of brine and ripe fruit, and Margaret said without preamble, "Elijah is not a man who shows what he feels. His father was the same way. It's not coldness. They feel things deeply. They just feel them quietly." Ruth looked at her hands where they were pressing the seal on a jar. "Is there a reason you're telling me this?" "Because," Margaret said, with the absolute directness of a woman who had decided to be done being indirect, "I've watched my son for 6 weeks and I've watched you for 6 weeks, and I can see what's happening even if neither of you has gotten around to saying it, and I want you to understand that quiet is not the same as absent." She set a jar down with a decisive click. "He is not Harlan Voss. He is not like that kind of man in any respect." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "I know that," she said. "Good," Margaret said. "Then stop being quite so careful." That advice sat with Ruth like a stone in a pocket, present and weighty. She turned it over in her mind through the rest of July and into August, and she thought about what it meant to let herself trust in the full sense, not just the surface sense, not just the transactional sense of trusting that Elijah would not harm her, which she had established firmly, but the deeper, terrifying sense of trusting someone with the interior of yourself. It was a thunderstorm that finally broke through her last careful reserve, which was appropriate, because thunderstorms on the Kansas prairie are not subtle things. This one came up fast on a Tuesday evening in early August, the sky going green and strange in that particular way it went before serious weather, the air suddenly electric and close. Ruth was alone in the house. Margaret had gone into Abilene for 2 days to visit her sister, and Thomas was in the bunkhouse with the hands, and Elijah was somewhere out with the cattle, and she told herself he would have enough sense to get to shelter. And then the storm hit. It was not a tornado, which Ruth had feared when she saw the sky, but it was serious sheets of rain driving sideways, lightning cracking every few minutes, the thunder arriving almost simultaneously and rattling the window frames in a way that made her breath come shorter than she wanted to admit. She moved through the house lighting lamps, because the darkness that came with the storm was total, and she was checking the back door latch when it burst open and Elijah came in with the storm behind him, soaked to the skin, hat gone somewhere in the weather, rainwater running off his hair and down his face. He pushed the door shut against the wind, and for a moment they just looked at each other in the lamplight, both of them breathing a little fast, him from the ride, her from the storm's assault on her composure, and something in the electric quality of the air between them had nothing to do with the lightning outside. "You're all right," he said, and it came out like something he'd needed to confirm. "I'm all right," she said. "Are you?" He pushed his wet hair back from his forehead and looked at her, and she thought she had never seen anyone look at her quite the way he was looking at her right now, with that particular combination of relief and warmth, and something else she had no name for except that it made her heart do something she hadn't given it permission to do. "Where's your hat?" she said, because she needed to say something practical. "Somewhere between here and the south pasture." He almost smiled. The wind made its opinion known. She went to get him a towel from the kitchen cabinet, and when she turned back he was standing close because the kitchen was not large, and she handed the towel to him, and their hands briefly overlapped on it, and neither of them moved for a moment that went 3 seconds past what it would have been if this were just two people passing a towel. Then she stepped back and he dried his face and he said, "Ruth." She looked at him. "I think you know," he said. He was not a man who dressed things up, and he wasn't going to start now. "I think you know what I've been feeling, and I think I know something about what you feel, and I'm not asking you to do anything about any of it tonight or any particular night. But I want you to know that I'm aware of it, and that it has nothing to do with," he paused, "with how we met, or with anything I think I did for you. That's separate from this." She stood with the counter edge against the small of her back and the lamplight warm on both of them and the storm throwing itself at the windows, and she said, because she was honest, "I know, I've been trying to be careful." "You can be as careful as you need to be," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." She breathed in. She breathed out. She said, I know that too. And then she smiled at him, not the careful, composed expression she wore when she was managing herself, but a real smile, something that came from further in than her surface. And the expression that moved across Elijah McCrae's face in response was so plainly, completely moved that Ruth stopped trying to pretend she wasn't absolutely sure of what she felt. The storm ran itself out by morning, leaving the prairie washed clean and glittering, the creek running high and bright, the air smelling of wet earth and renewed grass. Thomas came to breakfast in high spirits about the storm, describing from the bunkhouse perspective in the considerable detail of a young man who found everything dramatic and exciting. Margaret returned from Abilene the following day and looked between Elijah and Ruth at supper with the expression of someone who has identified a development and is choosing to be gracious about being right. The shift in things after that evening was not sudden. It was instead like the weather itself, a gradual change in the quality of the air between them, a new and acknowledged warmth where before there had been warmth trying to pass as professional regard. Elijah found reasons to be near the porch in the evenings. Ruth found she no longer brought her book as a defense against conversation. They really talked, the way people do when they have decided to let someone in about everything. About her mother, Clara, who had been a gentle woman without enough resources and too much hope in the wrong direction. About his father, James McCrae, who had built the ranch with his own hands from almost nothing and had died before seeing it achieve what it had become. About what Ruth wanted for herself, which she had not permitted herself to think about seriously in a long time, and which turned out to include things like security and purpose and the particular joy of being genuinely useful, and also, less practically, the sensation of belonging somewhere. "You belong here," he said one evening very simply, and then seemed almost surprised at himself for having said it, and Ruth looked at him from her chair and felt something in her chest that was both warm and aching. "I'm starting to think so," she said. He asked her to take a ride with him on a Sunday in late August, just the two of them, out along the creek where the cottonwoods were beginning to show the first yellow of the turning season. They rode at an easy pace, the horses content in the morning cool, the creek talking alongside them, and it was so entirely beautiful that Ruth found herself wishing she could capture the exact quality of the light and keep it somewhere. He pulled his horse up at a wide bend in the creek, where a big old cottonwood had partially fallen into the water and made a kind of natural seat, and they tied the horses and sat there in the shade with the water running past and the birds in the trees above, and he said, looking at the water, "I've been trying to figure out how to say something properly." She waited. He turned to look at her, and she saw in his face the same open honesty that had been there in the lamplight of the Dusty Rose Saloon when he'd torn up those papers. No performance, no management, just a man being straight with what was true. "I love you," he said. "I want to be clear about that, and I want to say it plainly so there's no room for misunderstanding. I love you, and I would like to court you properly, and eventually, if you're willing, I would like to ask you to marry me. Not because of anything except that you are exactly the person I want to be with, and this is your home now whether or not you ever feel anything back, but I very much hope you do." The cottonwood leaves turned in the light. The creek ran over the stones below them. Ruth looked at him for a long moment, this man who had torn up a document that claimed to own her and then given her back to herself, who had never once made her feel like a debt or an obligation or something that needed to be managed, who had said she belonged here before he'd ever said he loved her, which was the right order of things. "I love you," she said. "I have been trying not to for some time, but I've failed at it rather thoroughly." His face did a thing she hadn't seen it do before, something that was wholly unguarded and bright, and she thought she would like to see it do that as often as possible for as long as she lived. He reached over and took her hand carefully, as though asking permission with the slowness of the gesture, and she let him, and their hands sat together on the old fallen cottonwood with the creek running beneath them and the Kansas sky arched overhead and the horses nipping at the grass nearby, and it was one of the best moments Ruth Vaughn had ever had in her life. "I'm not going to rush you," he said. "On the question of marrying, you take whatever time you need." "I don't need a great deal of time," she said. "I've been alive 22 years and I know my own mind." He laughed at that, a real laugh surprised out of him, and she thought, yes, that sound. I want that sound for the rest of my life. They were formally courting through the fall of 1878, which in the practical terms of the frontier meant that there was a declared and acknowledged understanding between them, that Margaret McCrae was quietly pleased in her brisk way, and that Thomas, who found the whole thing enormously romantic, was with some effort persuaded not to make it the subject of extensive commentary at the supper table. There were practical matters, too. Ruth had been receiving her wages honestly since the beginning, and she had saved most of it, and she had the clarity of mind to understand that having her own resources was not something she was ever going to take for granted again. Elijah understood this without being told, understood that her independence was not a rejection of what they were to each other but a necessary piece of who she was, and he did not suggest otherwise. She wrote to the county clerk's office in Caldwell and confirmed, as she had expected, that the documents Harlan Voss had produced were a fiction. There was no legal guardianship, no legal anything, because Harlan had never had any legitimate authority over her. They had been papers he'd invented to make his particular transaction appear credible. The clerk's letter confirming as much was brief and impersonal, but Ruth read it 3 times and then folded it and put it with the note Elijah had written her on that first morning in Caldwell. She kept both of these documents in the tin box she'd bought at the general store in Abilene, which she kept under her bed. Together, they made a kind of record she intended to keep permanently. The fall was beautiful on the Kansas prairie, the grass turning gold and copper, and the sky going a deep clear blue that had something in it that summer's haze burned away. Ruth worked in the kitchen garden harvesting the last of the season, putting up the last preserves, watching the V-shapes of geese going south across the mornings, and she felt, in a way she had not let herself feel since before her mother had died, genuinely rooted, present in a place, connected to the soil under her feet and the people around her and the work she did. She and Elijah took their Sunday rides along the creek as the cottonwood leaves fell gold into the water, and they talked about everything, and sometimes they didn't talk at all and were equally content, and the ease between them was the real kind, the kind built from honesty rather than the practiced management of impression. He told her things about the ranch he was planning, improvements he wanted to make, his vision for what it could be in 10 years. She told him about the books she was reading and what she thought about them, and he listened with a genuineness of attention that she had never once experienced from Harlan Voss, and had in fact rarely experienced from any man, and it moved her every time. He proposed to her properly on a November evening, standing on the porch in the last of the light, the sky behind the pasture the color of embers, and he had a ring that had been his grandmother's simple gold with a small turquoise stone, the kind of thing that was honest and beautiful without display. And he went down on one knee on the porch boards, and Ruth Vaughn, who had not cried when she'd been put in a card game, or when Harlan had walked away, or when she'd slept alone on the prairie not knowing what her future held, felt her eyes go hot and bright at the sight of this man kneeling on his own porch in the evening light with his grandmother's ring, and the absolute earnestness of his face. "Ruth Vaughn," he said, "would you do me the honor of being my wife?" She said yes. She said it once clearly, and she meant it with everything she had. He slid the ring onto her finger and stood up, and she stepped forward, and they held each other on the porch in the ember-colored light, while the stars began to appear above the pasture, and Margaret McCrae, who had been absolutely watching from the kitchen window, turned back to her supper preparations with an expression that she would have described, if pressed, as professional satisfaction. They were married in December of 1878 in the church in Abilene, which was a plain and honest building that suited them both. Thomas had ridden down from wherever he'd been and stood at his brother's side, looking as though the occasion genuinely moved him, which it did, because Thomas McCrae was actually a tender-hearted young man beneath his loquaciousness. Margaret sat in the front pew in her good black dress with a posture of such complete composure that only a person who knew her well could have identified the brightness in her gray-green eyes as emotional. The preacher spoke briefly and plainly, which Elijah had specifically requested, and Ruth stood in the dress she'd made herself, ivory cotton with small pearl buttons, the best work she'd ever done with a needle, and she spoke her vows in a voice that was clear and steady and entirely certain. Outside the church, the December air was cold and sharp, and the sky was the flat pale blue of winter, and the streets of Abilene had a particular quality of stillness that cold days gave them. And Elijah McCrae put his wife up on his horse and then mounted behind her, and they rode back toward the ranch with the world quiet and bright around them and the future open in every direction. The winter settled in properly after that, and the McCrae ranch turned inward in the way of working properties in a Kansas winter, the rhythm slowing and deepening, the focus shifting to the maintenance of what had been built rather than the outward growth of it. Ruth found that winter on a proper ranch, with enough wood and enough provisions and enough company, was nothing like the winters she'd endured in Harlan's cold, badly provisioned cabin, and the contrast was not lost on her. She and Elijah found their life together with the same natural ease they'd found everything else. He was a man who respected space, who didn't crowd or claim, who let a room have two people in it without dominating it. She was a woman who had learned to manage herself carefully and was now, slowly and deliberately, unlearning the parts of that which had been survival strategies rather than genuine character. The way she sometimes held herself very still and very quiet when she was worried, which she was learning to replace with simply saying, "I'm worried about something." The way she had been accustomed to asking permission for small things, which she was replacing with simply doing them. He noticed both of these transitions and said nothing about either of them except once in January when she said, "Is it all right if I, about something entirely minor and inconsequential?" And he turned from the desk where he'd been going over ranch accounts and looked at her with great gentleness and said, "Ruth, you don't ask me permission for things. You're my wife and this is your home and your life. Do whatever it is." She had stood there for a moment feeling the weight of that permission was not the right word, but receiving was perhaps the right word, receiving the full dignity of it. And then she'd nodded and gone and done the thing without asking, and the feeling of that had been quietly extraordinary. Thomas left for Kansas City in March of 1879, which he did with the high spirits and the slight concealed nervousness of a young man setting out to become what he intended to be. He embraced his mother and shook his brother's hand and bowed to Ruth with a formality that made her laugh, and then hugged her too, and rode away down the lane with his saddlebags full of law books and Margaret watching from the porch with the kind of steady, loving composure that was her particular form of tenderness. That same spring, Ruth found herself pregnant. She told Elijah on a Tuesday morning in April, sitting at the kitchen table over coffee, because she was Ruth Vaughn and she told things plainly. She watched his face when she said it and saw it do the unguarded, bright thing it had done at the creek, but more so, amplified, as though the feeling behind it was too large for his usual contained expression and simply overflowed it. He reached across the table and took her hands, both of them in both of his, and he said, "Are you all right? How do you feel?" she said, nervous and happy and already thinking about logistics. He laughed that real laugh and held her hands tighter. "Of course you are," he said. "That's exactly right." Margaret, when told, produced a response so efficiently practical and simultaneously warm that it managed to communicate both deep joy and immediate organizational intent. She went to the baby's room that had been her own spare room and began assessing what was needed. And she wrote 2 letters that same afternoon, one to her sister in Abilene and one to a cousin in Wichita who had recently delivered and might have useful things to share. Ruth watched all of this and felt, beneath the nervousness that was appropriate and the happiness that was genuine, something she could only name as gratitude, for this family that had made space for her as though she had always been meant to be in it. The summer of 1879 passed in the way that pregnant summers do on a working ranch, slowly and warmly, with Ruth adapting her work as she needed to and refusing to reduce it more than was actually necessary, and Elijah checking on her with a frequency that she found both touching and occasionally excessive, which she told him, which made him look briefly chastened, and then continue checking on her anyway. She read every book she could find about childbirth and infant care, which was not many, because the literature available in Abilene on the subject was limited. But she did what she could, and she talked to Margaret, who had 2 living children and had delivered both of them in this same region with the same combination of frontier practicality and faith in the fundamental hardiness of the human body. "You will be fine," Margaret said one evening, with the complete certainty of someone who has decided that equivocation is not useful in this situation. "You are strong and practical and healthy, and you will be fine." Ruth said, "I believe you," and she did. On a clear September morning in 1879, with the summer heat just beginning to relent and the first suggestion of the turning season in the air, Ruth delivered a son. The doctor came from Abilene, a competent man named Dr. Aldous Hensley, who had delivered more frontier babies than he could remember, and Margaret was there, and the ranch hands were conspicuously busy with extremely important tasks nowhere near the house, and Elijah was in the kitchen being managed by his mother's occasional instructions through the wall, and generally being too anxious to be useful, which was entirely human of him. The boy arrived in the morning and announced himself with the robust certainty of someone who had opinions about his entry into the world. Ruth held him red and wrinkled and absolutely extraordinary, and felt something expand in her chest so dramatically that she understood for the first time what people meant when they said that love could be enormous enough to frighten you. Elijah was permitted in a few minutes later, still slightly pale, and he looked at the baby in Ruth's arms and then at Ruth, and the expression on his face was the most undone she had ever seen him, and she loved him for it. "He's incredible," Elijah said, in a voice that was quieter than his usual voice, hushed by the weight of it. "He is," Ruth said. "Come here." He sat beside her on the bed, and she put the baby into his arms, and she watched Elijah McCrae hold his son for the first time with the concentrated, tender care of a man who understands that he is holding something incomprehensibly important, and she thought, "This is the beginning of everything real." They named him James, for Elijah's father, and called him Jamie from the first day because James was a serious name for a very small person. Jamie McCrae arrived in the world and immediately made it clear that he intended to occupy it thoroughly. He was, from the beginning, a curious and energetic child, which Ruth had perhaps been warned about by his first few weeks, but had not quite understood until he was mobile. He pulled himself upright on chair legs before he was 10 months old, and regarded the world from this new elevation with an expression of deep satisfaction. Elijah watched all of this with a combination of parental pride and genuine awe that Ruth found endlessly charming. Life on the ranch expanded and deepened around them. Elijah's cattle operation grew through 1880 and 1881 good years for the cattle trade in Kansas, and Elijah was a man who made sound decisions and maintained honest relationships with the drovers and buyers he worked with, and the reputation of the McCrae ranch as a fair and competent operation spread accordingly. Ruth managed the household and the books with the same systematic effectiveness she'd brought to it from the beginning, but increasingly she was also involved in the larger business decisions, because Elijah asked her opinion on things and genuinely valued it, and the two of them together made better decisions than either one alone. Margaret, in the fall of 1880, announced that she had been corresponding for some time with a man in Wichita, a widower, a retired merchant, a decent man she'd known years before, and that she had decided to marry him and would be moving to Wichita in the spring. She delivered this information with her characteristic composure and equal characteristic refusal to be sentimental about it. But Ruth could see the happiness underneath it, quiet and certain, and she was glad. "You've built something good here," Margaret told her, on the evening before she left for Wichita with her trunks and her cookbooks, and her sourdough starter transferred carefully into a new crock for the journey. She was speaking to Ruth specifically. "This ranch and this family and this life. You understand what you've done here," Ruth said. "I think so." Margaret shook her head slightly. "I don't think you quite do. You came here with a cloth bag and 37 cents and you made a home." She paused. "I was worried when Elijah wrote to say he was bringing someone home from Caldwell. I want you to know that. I was worried he'd done something foolish and impulsive that would complicate everything." Ruth almost smiled. And instead, Margaret said, "he did the only purely correct thing I've ever seen him do entirely on instinct. And you, for your part, took what was offered and made it into more than it was." She nodded once, the gesture that meant the matter was settled and required no further discussion. "I'm proud of you both." Ruth felt the back of her eyes go warm, which was becoming less unusual than it once was, and she said, "Thank you, Margaret, for everything." Margaret left for Wichita on a Tuesday morning in April of 1881, and Elijah rode with her to the train station and put her on the train and came back quiet and thoughtful. And that evening, Ruth sat with him on the porch and let the quiet be what it needed to be, and after a while he said, "She'll be happy there." And Ruth said, "Yes, she will." And she meant it, and he heard that she meant it, and they sat together on the porch in the spring evening watching Jamie, who was a year and a half old now and determined to investigate every object within his reach on the porch. And the grassland rolled out before them in the last light, and the creek shone somewhere in the middle distance, and the sky above the valley was going orange and rose. Letters from Thomas came regularly from Kansas City, cheerful, voluble letters full of law school opinions, and city observations and questions about Jamie that grew increasingly specific as Jamie's personality became clearer in Ruth's descriptions. Thomas was doing well, would qualify at the end of 1882, had already made connections that suggested a good future at the bar. He wrote to Ruth as much as to Elijah, which had begun as a natural extension of his social nature, and which Ruth had come to value genuinely, because Thomas in letters was as warm and direct as Thomas in person, and she had grown fond of him in the way one grows fond of family that is actually, fully, family. Ruth became pregnant again in the fall of 1881, and this time her dominant experience was competence. She knew what to expect, she knew her body, she knew how this went, and a deep, uncomplicated happiness. Elijah was no less moved than he had been the first time, though he managed the waiting rather better. Their second child was a daughter, born in the summer of 1882 on a July evening when the light came through the bedroom window gold and long-angled, and she arrived with a determination that suggested she was going to be extremely clear about her preferences from the outset, which proved entirely accurate in the years that followed. They named her Clara, for Ruth's mother. Clara McCrae was, from the first, a deliberate and watchful child. She reminded Ruth, in ways that were deeply tender to her, of her own younger self. She watched the world before she engaged it. She cataloged before she concluded. By the time she was speaking in full sentences, she was doing so with a precision that made Elijah look at Ruth with an expression that said, "I can see where she gets that." Jamie, 4 years old when Clara was born, was immediately and entirely captivated by his sister, which was both very sweet and occasionally chaotic, because Jamie's affection expressed itself through activity, and Clara's response to activity was to administer it rather than submit to it. The ranch house in the evenings, sometimes, had the quality of a very small parliament. Thomas came home for Christmas in 1882, having passed his bar examinations, and he was 23 years old and considerably more polished in the way of a man who had lived in a city for 3 years, but fundamentally and obviously still Thomas, which Ruth was glad of. He sat at the Christmas supper table with Elijah and Ruth and Jamie climbing on his uncle's knee, and Clara watching proceedings from her mother's lap with her serious eyes. And he told stories about Kansas City that made everyone laugh. And Margaret had come down from Wichita with her husband Harold, who turned out to be a quiet, kind man with a dry sense of humor that Margaret clearly appreciated. And the house was warm and noisy and full in all the right ways. Thomas settled in Abilene in the spring of 1883, setting up a law practice in a modest office on the main street, and this proved to be the right decision. He was a good lawyer and he was known and trusted in the area, and the practice grew steadily. He came to the ranch for Sunday suppers as often as twice a month, and Jamie adored him and Clara tolerated him with the considering expression she gave most things before she decided she liked them, which she eventually did. On a spring evening in 1883, almost exactly 5 years to the month after that night in Caldwell, Ruth sat on the porch in the evening light with Clara asleep against her shoulder, and Jamie, inside being read to by Elijah. The sound of Elijah's voice carrying through the open window in the particular low cadence he used for stories. And she looked out at the grassland and the creek and the cottonwoods and the enormous Kansas sky going through its nightly colors. And she thought about the night she had stood in a corner of a saloon with her hands folded, and the knowledge that she was being wagered like a saddle. And she thought about the sound of paper tearing, and she thought about the question he'd asked at the campfire, "Are you all right?" Not the polite answer, the true one. And she thought about the creek bend and the cottonwood and the turquoise ring on her finger that she still wore every day. She looked at her hands. Clara's small weight against her shoulder, the ring on her finger catching the last of the light. The door opened, and Elijah came out and stood at the porch railing and looked out at the evening, and then turned and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and something passed between them in that look that did not need words and hadn't needed them for years. The full, complete acknowledgement of everything they had built and everything they were, and everything that lay ahead of them. He came and sat beside her, and Clara stirred slightly on Ruth's shoulder and settled, and he put his arm around Ruth and she leaned into him, and the evening star appeared above the pasture, one bright point in the deepening sky, the first and brightest. "What are you thinking?" he asked quietly so as not to wake Clara. She thought about it honestly, the way she always did. "That 5 years ago I had 37 cents in a cloth bag and a comb and my mother's brooch," she said. "And now I have this, all of this." She paused. "I was thinking that I am so grateful that I don't quite have a word for it." He pulled her a little closer. "I'm grateful too," he said. "What are you grateful for?" He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was thinking about it properly. "For the storm," he said, which surprised her. "The one that first summer. That knocked my hat off somewhere between here and the south pasture. Because you were standing in the kitchen when I came in and the way you looked at me, and I thought, I am absolutely done pretending this is anything other than what it is." She smiled, there in the evening with Clara warm on her shoulder. "I remember the towel. I very nearly didn't let go of the towel," he said. She laughed quietly, and Clara made a small sound and settled deeper, and the evening spread out before them vast and soft and full of the good smell of the prairie in spring. The following year brought the kind of news that changed the ranch's future in a concrete way. The Chicago Railroad had extended its line, and a new depot was being planned closer to the McCrae Valley, which meant that moving cattle to market was going to become significantly easier and less expensive. And Elijah had already begun thinking about what that made possible: a larger operation, more head, possibly the adjacent property to the north that old Jennings wanted to sell now that his own sons had gone east. He and Ruth went over the books together at the kitchen table on the winter evenings, the lamp between them and the fire at their backs and the children asleep upstairs, and they planned it out together the way they planned everything. She asked sharp questions when she had them, and he respected that. He knew the land better than anyone, and she knew the numbers better than anyone, and together they understood both the limits and the possibilities, and what they built together was always better than what either one would have built alone. Thomas, in the spring of 1884, came to Sunday supper and brought someone with him, a young woman named Alice Holt, from a farming family in the Abilene area, 21 years old, quiet and intelligent and clearly extremely fond of Thomas in the way she tried not to show it yet. Ruth watched them over supper with the pleasure of someone who recognizes something she knows well, and afterward, when Thomas was playing with Jamie in the yard and Alice was helping Ruth carry dishes to the kitchen, Ruth said simply, "He talks about you when he writes to us." Alice went slightly pink and said, "Does he?" "He does," Ruth said, "and he uses the particular tone that people use when they're trying to be casual about something they care about very much." Alice looked at her for a moment, and then she smiled, and she had a lovely smile, and Ruth thought, "Yes, this will be fine." Thomas and Alice were married in 1885, which was, Ruth privately calculated, a satisfyingly tidy development, and their first child, a boy named James for the grandfather none of them had met, arrived in 1886, which brought Jamie McCrae, then 7 years old, who had the McCrae family's same deep investment in family, to a level of excitement about his cousin that the ranch house contained only with some effort. Ruth's third child arrived in the autumn of 1885, a second son they named William, who arrived with a constitution of such evident robustness that the Dr. Hensley again, who had delivered all 3 McCrae children, said that this one had opinions about his own health and intended to enforce them. William at 18 months was already the sturdiest presence in any room he occupied. Jamie found him fascinating. Clara managed him with the systematic competence that she applied to all challenging situations. The ranch expanded as planned. The adjacent Jennings property was purchased in the spring of 1886, and the new railroad depot made the cattle operation more profitable than it had been in the previous decade, and Elijah rode the expanded pastures in the mornings with the satisfaction of a man who has built something worth building and knows it. Ruth tracked all of it in the books with the precision she'd always brought to accounts, and she felt, looking at those figures, the same satisfaction, the evidence of real work producing real results, honest and legible, and hers. She had taken in 1885 to writing regularly for the Abilene Chronicle, the local newspaper, whose editor had approached her after reading a letter she'd written to the paper about the inadequacy of legal protections for women in Kansas Territory. The editor, a progressive-minded man named Hart, had asked if she'd be willing to write more, and she had said she would think about it, and she had thought about it, and she had said yes. Her columns were not long, but they were sharp and honest and argued clearly from evidence, and they addressed things like the legal status of women in property matters and the absence of meaningful recourse in cases of the kind of exploitation she had herself experienced. She did not write about herself specifically. That was not the point. The point was the structural argument. But she wrote with the authority of someone who understood the subject from the inside, and the response from readers was significant enough that Hart gave her a regular column by the spring of 1886. Elijah read everything she wrote and said almost nothing about any of it except once, when she handed him a piece she was particularly uncertain about. It was sharper than her usual work, more direct in its criticism of a specific local ordinance, and he read it carefully and handed it back and said, "This is your best work." She looked at him. "You're not worried about it." "Why would I be worried about it?" She thought for a moment. Some men would be. About their wife being public about things like this. He looked at her with that plain hazel gaze. "Ruth, you told me in Caldwell that you were angry about what could be done to a woman and what the law had to say about it. That was 6 years ago, and you were right then and you're right now, and you should say so in print. I've never been worried about you saying true things." She looked at him for a long moment. "I love you," she said, which she said often and easily now, the words not smaller for the frequency but larger. "I love you," he said. "Send it to Hart." She sent it to Hart. The years moved through the late 1880s with the rhythm of a life fully and well lived. Jamie grew into a serious, capable boy who was clearly going to be a rancher. He had the land in him the way his father did, a deep instinctive understanding of the cattle and the pasture, and the seasonal rhythms that some people have and some people don't. Elijah taught him deliberately and with patience, and watching them together in the pasture or the barn, the tall man and the boy growing into his height, Ruth felt the particular richness of witnessing something being passed down with love and intention. Clara was brilliant in a way that her teachers in the Abilene school noted, with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Ruth was entirely clear about what she intended for Clara: every educational opportunity available, every door that could be opened. Elijah was equally clear. Clara was, at 8 years old, already a formidable reader, and her questions about the world were the kind that stopped adults briefly before they answered because the questions were good. Ruth watched Clara read and thought about her mother Clara, who had died without enough resources and too much hope in the wrong direction, and she thought, this one is going to have resources. This one is going to choose her direction and it will be hers. William was, at 3 and then 4 and then 5, precisely as robust and opinionated as the doctor had predicted, and he attached himself to both his parents and his siblings with an absolute confidence in being loved that was, Ruth thought, the most wonderful thing about him. He had somehow arrived in the world already certain that he was wanted, and that certainty made him open and warm and impossible not to adore. There came a November evening in 1889, a decade nearly, past the night in Caldwell, when Elijah came in from the cold, stamping the mud from his boots, and Ruth was at the kitchen table going over accounts and smelling of the sage and dried lavender she kept in a bundle near the window, and he poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove and came and sat across from her. And the lamp was between them and the fire was warm, and the children were somewhere in the back of the house making the sounds of children who were alive and absorbed and cared for. He looked at her across the books and the lamp. She looked up from the accounts. There was a long, particular silence. "What?" she said, because she could see something on his face. "Nothing," he said. "I'm just looking at you." She set down her pen. "In what way are you looking at me?" He thought about it. "In the way I look at the ranch from the hill in the morning," he said. "When the light's good and everything is the way it should be, and I think, this is what I was building toward. This is what it was for." Ruth Vaughn McCrae looked at her husband across the kitchen table, with their books between them and the lamp burning between them and the fire at their backs and the children in the back of the house, and the enormous Kansas sky outside the window and the history of everything that had brought them here behind them, and she felt the specific quality of a happiness that had been earned and was therefore the most real kind. She picked up her pen. "You're going to make me ruin the accounts," she said. He smiled, the real smile, the one that had started at the creek and she'd been collecting ever since, and he said, "The accounts can wait." She set the pen down again. He reached across the table, past the books and the lamp, and took her hand. Outside, the November wind moved through the Kansas grassland with the cold, clean smell of the coming winter, and somewhere beyond the hill the creek ran on through the dark as it had always run, over the same smooth stones, into the same good valley, and the McCrae ranch was lit from within against the darkness like something that had been built to last and intended to. The years that followed moved with the satisfying completeness of a life that had found its true shape and was living it fully. Thomas thrived in his law practice, and he took several cases, pro bono, he called it, explaining the term to Jamie with the earnestness of someone who believed strongly in the words they used, involving women's property rights and contract disputes that reflected, in their careful legal arguments, some of the same structural concerns Ruth addressed in her Chronicle columns. Brother and sister-in-law, it turned out, shared more than a family table. They shared a view of what justice required, and the conversations at Sunday suppers grew richer for it. Margaret came down from Wichita with Harold every Christmas until Harold's death in 1891, after which she came alone, and she was still Margaret brisk, warm in the underneath way, impossibly competent, and she watched her grandchildren with the same careful, assessing gaze she'd turned on Ruth 11 years prior, and what she found in them clearly satisfied her. Jamie, at 15, was effectively running parts of the ranch operation under Elijah's supervision. Clara, at 13, was already corresponding with the women's colleges in the East and had written, on her own initiative, to a professor at the State Agricultural College in Manhattan, Kansas, who was conducting research on drought-resistant grain varieties, because Clara had read her mother's early seed merchant correspondence and had thoughts about it, and the professor had written back, which Clara received with quiet triumph. William, at 9, had decided he wanted to be a veterinarian because he was not, after mature reflection, primarily interested in cows as cattle, but was profoundly interested in what made living things work, and he had begun following the veterinarian who came to the ranch, with an attention so focused that the veterinarian had started explaining things to him as a matter of course. "We made extraordinary people," Elijah said to Ruth one evening in 1892, watching all three of them argue about something at the supper table, the kind of vigorous intellectual disagreement that was fully good-natured and that their parents had always encouraged. "We gave them room to be what they were going to be," Ruth said. "That's the same thing." She considered this. "Yes," she said, "I suppose it is." She had turned 36 that year, and she had the particular quality that some people arrive at in the middle years of their lives when they are living them correctly: a settledness, a warmth, a sense of being fully present in the life they were in rather than a slightly earlier or later version of it. Her dark hair had a single thread of silver at the left temple that she found she did not mind in the least. The worry lines that had lived at the corners of her eyes in Caldwell lines that were not about age but about watchfulness and the constant management of danger had softened into something else entirely, into the expression of a person who had long since stopped needing to monitor every angle of the room. Elijah at 40 was more himself than he had been at 26, which was the way it worked when a man lived his life honestly. He had the weathered face of a man who spent his days outdoors, and his hair was threaded with gray at the temples now, and the hands that had always been working hands were more so, and Ruth found him, in the particular way of long and genuine love, more beautiful than she had the first time she'd allowed herself to really look at him. There was a February morning in 1893 when a letter arrived from Caldwell. It was not from anyone Ruth knew. It was from the county recorder's office, a routine document regarding land records in a different matter entirely, addressed in error to her as the former resident of Harlan Voss's property, and it required nothing more than a letter informing the recorder of the error. But the return address, Caldwell, Sumner County, Kansas, sent Ruth to the window for a moment, and she stood with the letter and looked out at the winter pasture, white and still, and she thought about that night and all the nights before it and all the nights since. She thought about standing in a corner with her hands folded and everything in her that was alive and real and full sealed up behind a composure she'd built out of necessity. She thought about the sound of paper tearing. She thought about a voice asking, "What's your name?" She set the letter on the table and picked up her pen and wrote the recorder's office a brief, clear, entirely cheerful response indicating the address error, signed it Ruth Vaughn McCrae, and sealed it, and went on with her mourning. That evening she told Elijah about it. Not because it required telling, but because she told him things, because they were the kind of people who told each other things, and he listened with the attentiveness he always brought to whatever she said, and at the end he said, "How did it feel?" "Small," she said. Caldwell felt very small, and the night at the Dusty Rose felt very far away. "Is that good?" She thought about it honestly. "It's good," she said, "but I don't want to forget it entirely. It matters. What happened matters. Not as suffering to carry, but as evidence of what is possible and what is unacceptable and why the things I write about in the Chronicle matter." He nodded. "You've turned it into something." "We turned it into something," she said. "Together." He looked at her. "Together," he agreed. The spring of 1893 came in soft and green. Jamie was 18 that spring and had already, with his father's help, begun the management of the North Pasture, the Jennings land, as his own responsibility within the operation. And he did it with the same quiet confidence that Elijah had always brought to the land, as though the grass and the cattle and the seasonal rhythms were speaking a language he'd been born knowing. He was tall like his father and dark-haired like his mother, and had the particular combination of their best qualities in a way that Ruth sometimes found so moving she had to look at something else for a moment. Thomas brought his family over on a Sunday in June. Alice and their 3 children, who ranged from 7 to 2 and occupied the McCrae yard with tremendous energy. And the supper table was full and loud, and Thomas was telling a story about a case he'd won that week, speaking with the animation of a man doing exactly what he was meant to do, and Ruth looked around the table at all of it, all of them, and thought about 37 cents and a cloth bag and a bone comb and her mother's brooch. And she thought about what could be built from almost nothing if what you started with was yourself. She thought about how the bravest thing she'd ever done was not surviving Harlan Voss, though that had required courage. The bravest thing she'd ever done was accepting what Elijah offered in that Caldwell street and believing, carefully and honestly, that it was genuine. The bravest thing she'd done was learning, slowly and against the grain of everything that had taught her otherwise, to let herself be loved without a transaction attached to it. The table around her was the evidence. After supper, when the children were in the yard and the summer evening was long and gold, Ruth and Elijah sat on the porch in their chairs the way they had sat for years, and the grassland lay before them in the late light, the creek shining in its tree-lined channel, the big sky going through its evening performance of color, orange and rose and the deep clear blue of the upper atmosphere, and the first star appeared, the same evening star that had always appeared. Reliable as anything Ruth McCrae had come to trust completely, Elijah reached over and took her hand. She held his. The prairie grass moved in the evening wind, and somewhere across the pasture an owl called once, the sound carrying cleanly across the still air, and the porch was warm, and the house behind them was full of all the living that had made it what it was, and Ruth Vaughn McCrae sat in the last of the golden light with her husband's hand in hers and understood, completely and without reservation, that this was what her life was, and it was good honestly, fully, completely good, and it had been worth every broken, difficult, cold, hungry, frightened step that had led here, because here was what she'd been walking toward without knowing it, and she had arrived. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. The evening star brightened as the sky darkened around it, and the Kansas night came on in its slow, enormous way, and the McCrae ranch settled into the dark the way it settled every night, comfortable and rooted and real. And inside the house the lamp went on, and the voices of the people they loved most moved through the lit rooms. And outside on the porch Ruth and Elijah sat in the good dark and held on, and the prairie breathed around them and the creek ran on through the valley. And the world was large and honest, and full of the specific grace of things that are built from nothing into everything.